Hey guys, it's Maddie.
And Dante.
And this week we will be talking about food chains. But before we get into that, we're going to go over our weekly Earth Stewardship Pledge.
So follow along with us. We're going to do it with the gestures. Ready?
I pledge to care about the world around me, to investigate and explore the world around me, to share my learning and do service, to make the world around me a better place for plants, animals, and people. I carry this commitment with me always. I am an Earth Steward.
Thanks for following along. We're going to go ahead and get into our lesson this week, which I think is a really cool one. And that's about food chains. You've probably heard that before, or you've probably seen them too. But no matter what, you're going to learn, hopefully in this lesson, more about food chains and what they mean. So first things first, we're going to revisit what we talked about last week, though. So do you remember our word of the day? Hopefully, ecosystems. So an ecosystem is a system of living things. We gave the example of the forest ecosystem, where you had plants and animals living together and needing each other to live. We talked about the trees and how the trees provided habitat or provided shelter and food for all kinds of animals. And if you take out the trees, the ecosystem wouldn't exist. We're going to talk about something very similar this week. Ecosystems are made up of many plants and animals which eat each other. Food chains help to describe what eats what.
So our word of the day, food chains. Food chains describe the transfer of energy from one living thing to another within an ecosystem. It's just a way to describe the order in which things are eaten, how that energy is transferred to each animal, and how that all cycles, and the cycle of food chains and food webs makes an ecosystem. So what's a food chain anyways? As I said, it's kind of an example of how energy is transferred. This is just one example of a complete food chain. Now, this might look really complicated, but don't worry. We're going to break it down step by step. And by the end of this, you should be able to make your own food chains.
So where does a food chain start? Well, a food chain starts with things called producers. Producers are living organisms or living things that produce their own food. They don't eat other things to get their food. They produce their own food. So a very common or the most common producer are plants. Plants, trees, that sort of thing, they get their food from the sun. So we're going to be talking about or showing these arrows a lot. These arrows don't mean that the sun eats the plants or the water eats the plants. It means that the sun is transferring its energy to the plants. So keep that in mind. That's what the arrows mean. So plants or producers receive their energy from the sun. They take in CO2 from the atmosphere, or carbon dioxide, as it's also called, and water from the hydrosphere, and that's how they grow. They don't eat other things. They are producers.
So producers are organisms or living things which make their own food with the energy from the sun. They use sunlight, water, and nutrients to get energy. And this process is called photosynthesis. Now, you don't need to worry about that word, but just remember it's the process in which plants make their own food. And some examples of producers are algae, flowers, trees, seaweed. If it's green and in the ground, then it's most likely a producer.
So next step in the food chain, consumers. So this is the part of the food chain which contains our consumers, and we're going to talk about each of these one by one now. But first, what's a consumer?
So consumers are animals that eat other living things. So like we said, with producers, they make their own food. They don't need to eat anything. Consumers are the opposite. They need to eat other living things to get that energy, to have that energy transfer.
So there are three types of consumers. We just talked about how consumers are animals that eat other things. So that means they have to eat things. You might have heard these words before: herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. So our first, herbivores. Herbivores are consumers which eat only plants. So you would call them a vegan or a vegetarian. They eat only plants. So this grasshopper here, he's only thinking about the grass or the producer. Then next up is an omnivore. They eat plants and animals, so they're not so picky. They'll eat whatever they can really find. We have this bear here. He's thinking about a grasshopper and berries, so he'll eat other animals and the producers, the plants. And then finally, carnivore. These guys will only eat meat. They'll only eat other animals. So he's thinking about the chipmunk and this little bunny rabbit. So now we're going to give some examples of each of these two.
So in herbivore, they're usually insects. They're like ants, and they can even be like bunnies. Just think of animals that only eat plants. Omnivores include things like us. We're omnivores. We'll eat anything. Bears, chipmunks, and squirrels are also omnivores, and most birds are omnivores. And then carnivores, there's very few things that are true carnivores, but they include things like our lynx and mountain lions, and snakes.
Just to briefly recap, consumers are animals which eat other living things. So they will eat producers or other animals. And producers are
things that make their own food with the energy from sun, nutrients, and soil.
So now we're going to do a drawing activity.
So draw yourself as an animal. We would like you guys to tell us what type of animal you are. Are you an herbivore? You only eat plants. An omnivore? You eat plants and animals. Or a carnivore? You only eat other animals. And then lastly, what type of animal eats you?
So I did a little example drawing of Miss Maddie as an herbivore cat. So this is what Miss Maddie would look like as a cat. So she's an herbivore, which means she's only eating plants, but she's actually eating really unhealthy plants. So this is a vegan cake down here. It's only made out of plants, but it's still not good for you. It's got a lot of sugar in it. She's eating fruit. So I only eat sweet things. So over here, this is the second question, or the third question, I should say. What type of animal eats you? So this little weird mouse dude, he's eating Maddie. So just try to include all those things in your drawing, and we'll see you in 5 to 10 minutes, or as long as your teacher wants to give you to complete this activity.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that little activity, and if you can, please upload these to your journals. We always love to see what you guys create. So now, back to the food chain. So if you guys remember, we start with our producer, which gets their energy from the sun, CO2, and water. This energy is transferred to our producer. And then next up, we have our consumers. So here we have a grasshopper, which is an herbivore consumer. It doesn't always have to be an herbivore, but is usually a producer eating consumer that is the next in the food chain.
So what eats a producer? Consumers eat producers. So this guy, he's a consumer. We already told you he's an herbivore. He's only eating producers. So the energy is transferred to the grasshopper when he eats the plant. So next up in the food chain,
we have consumer eats consumer. This grasshopper's energy is transferred to this bluebird, which is an omnivore consumer. It eats both plants and animals.
So next step up, well, what eats the bluebird? A hawk eats the bluebird. So when the hawk eats the bluebird, the energy is transferred to the hawk. The hawk is a top dog. Nothing really eats a hawk. So they're not only a carnivore, they only eat meat, but there's something that we'll talk about next week called an apex predator. You might have heard that term before. That just means nothing eats them. They're the top dog of the food chain. So what happens to the top dog of the food chain? He just ate a bluebird, but eventually he'll die too.
So when something dies, it doesn't just stay on the forest floor. You don't come across just full dead animals. It is decomposed, it is broken down. Its energy is taken in by decomposers. So the hawk, once it dies, energy goes to decomposers. Here we have a fungi, we have a mushroom. That is just one example of a decomposer. So what are decomposers? They are things that break down and eat dead things for energy. These include things like fungi, bacteria, worms, and some insects like snails and beetles.
So what happens next? Well, the decomposer, so our things like our fungi, break down the dead thing, and eventually they too break down into dirt. The dirt then becomes nutrients for producers again. So the energy goes from fungi to dirt, and then dirt provides nutrients back to our plants or our producers. So you can see where the food chain would start over again. We have the producers once again, which can be eaten. So now we're going to bring it all back together and show you the complete food chain once more.
So we start with our producers. So the producers, they make their own food with the energy given to them by the sun, CO2, and water. From there, the energy from the producer is transferred to our consumer, this grasshopper here. And this consumer is an herbivore consumer. It only eats plants. This consumer is then eaten by another consumer, our bluebird. Its energy is transferred to the bluebird. And then that bluebird's energy is then transferred to our hawk, which is a carnivore. It only eats meat. And once that hawk dies, it is broken down, decomposed by our decomposers. Its energy is transferred to things like mushrooms and worms and beetles. And then all of that broken down matter stuff is then used by the plants to, again, make their own food. So that is the complete food chain. It is a cycle. And you can see if you were to take out one of these, the cycle would be broken. It would not be able to continue.
So this is just one example of a food chain. Each ecosystem has many, many, many food chains. So for instance, a grasshopper might be eaten by 15 different animals, and a bluebird might eat 15 different things, and each of those you can describe as its own food chain. So we're going to give some more food chain examples now, and you guys are going to get to try out your knowledge of food chains.
So with this activity, we have 3 different living things. We have grass, bunny, and our wolf here. So, and we provided you this word bank. So what we want you guys to do is tell us, is this a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer on each one of these? So teachers give the students about a minute, however long it takes to answer these questions, and we will check back in shortly to see if you guys got it right.
So hopefully you were able to give some guesses here on what each of these are. So first, producer. So this plant here, he's getting his energy from the sun. He's not eating other things. He's producing his own energy, or his own food, I should say. Next, this bunny rabbit here, this is a consumer and also an herbivore. He's only eating producers, only eating plants. And then finally, he gets eaten by this wolf, and this wolf is a consumer, a carnivore, only eating meat. So that's the first one. Each one is going to get a little bit more complicated. So next food chain for you guys to try filling out.
So we have our grass, our grasshopper, our frog, and an owl. And here we have another word bank, a little bit bigger this time. So do your best, and teachers, again, give them about 1 minute to answer this, whatever you think, and we will check back in.
Let's go through this one now. So first, hopefully you got it right. That's producer, getting his energy from the sun, producing his own food. Next up is a grasshopper, a consumer herbivore, which eats the plant. So what eats the grasshopper is the frog. The frog is an omnivore. Omnivore eats meat or eats animals and plants. And then finally, this frog gets eaten by a consumer carnivore. Owls only eat meat or other animals. So the next one is a really hard example, but hopefully you can get it right.
So here we have a blackberry bush, a caterpillar, a bluebird, a snake, a fox, and a mushroom. So again, do your best, and remember, these words, or not remember, I'm sorry, this is just a little fact, these words can be used more than once. So do your best, and again, we'll see you in about a minute.
So the first step, we start off with a producer. Like every food chain, we start with a producer who gets eaten by
a consumer, or an herbivore consumer. It only eats plants, so that energy was transferred.
Next up, this caterpillar gets eaten by this bluebird, who is an omnivore and a consumer, so will eat both plants and animals.
That energy is then transferred to our snake, which is a carnivore consumer.
And next up, this one might surprise you. So this is, of course, is a fox. He's a consumer, but he's an omnivore. Foxes will eat both plants and animals. So you might be confused now. Why is a omnivore eating a carnivore? I thought carnivores were the top of the food chain, but it doesn't quite work like that. Instead, carnivores can be in the middle of a food chain. They don't necessarily have to be at the top. And omnivores, like us, can be at the top of the food chain. So just because it's a carnivore doesn't necessarily mean that other things don't eat it too.
And then we end the cycle with a decomposer. Our mushroom will break down this dead fox and make soil for our next producer.
So now we have a little game, or we're providing you with a little game here from BBC. So for teachers, hopefully this isn't blocked and hopefully you're able to play it with the kids. This goes on for a really long time if you let it. So just play for a little while, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and then come back. You want to explain the game?
Oh, so you're just building a food chain. It has examples of consumers and producers. It's very, if you're still unsure, it will explain it for you, but you're just building different food chains yourself. So enjoy, and we'll be back soon to complete the lesson. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that game. I thought it was a lot of fun, but now we're going to finish our lesson. So what we have been building up to is a food web. So we've been talking about chains and how energy is transferred through an ecosystem. But when you put all of those chains together, it makes an entire ecosystem. And it is also called a food web. So this is just another way to show an ecosystem. It shows how the energy is transferred, what eats what, and how each part of this food web is essential for the ecosystem to work. So we're just going to go through what energy is transferred where. So we have a caterpillar. Its energy is transferred to the bluebird, chipmunks, and frogs. A tree, its energy is transferred to a caterpillar, a beaver, a grasshopper, and a deer. Bluebird is transferred to an owl, a snake, and a black bear. Chipmunk to the owl and the snake. A beaver is eaten by bears and surprisingly owls, which is pretty insane given how big beavers are. Grasshoppers they are eaten by chipmunks, birds, and frogs. A snake will a snake's energy will be transferred to an owl and even to a chipmunk. Chipmunks will basically eat anything. They're quite ferocious. If you guys didn't know, they're not just cute and cuddly. They have a mean bite. And then our blackberry bush, that energy is transferred to the grasshopper, bluebird, caterpillar, and black bear. Acorns are eaten and their energy is transferred to chipmunks, bluebirds, and black bear. A deer is eaten by a black bear. A frog's eaten by a lot like bluebirds, chipmunks, owls, and snakes. And worms, a decomposer, is eaten by frogs, chipmunks, and birds. And so then once all of this stuff dies, any of this dead matter stuff, all of that energy goes to our decomposers, which breaks it down for that soil, which is then used by the producers to keep the cycle going. So this just shows how everything is interconnected. All these lines, everything, they all rely on each other. And if you were to take one of these out, this food web would collapse. The ecosystem would not be there.
So now we're going to finish off. Hopefully you enjoyed that lesson. And next week, we're going to be talking about predators and prey. So mean animals and animals that get eaten.
But this week's journal prompt is, what's your favorite herbivore, omnivore, and carnivore? So tell us what it is, what it likes to eat, get specific. Does he eat grasshoppers? Does he eat tacos? Does he eat worms or foxes? Really just go off on it. Tell us where it lives. And we always love reading your journal. So very excited to hear what you guys have to say.
But with that, we'll see you next week.
Bye, guys.